In this video, we're going to look at Chapter 21, the Furnace of Civil War. And so we'll go through all the major battles and the course of the war. First big idea is that this is a pretty dang big war. And I'm only going to talk about a few battles, key battles. And so as you look at this map, you can see patterns when it comes to battles and just the casualties as they increase over time, with a few key points like here's Gettysburg and a few other major battles. And there's a whole bunch of little battles, but we're just going to talk about the big ones. So these really big dots that we see, like Gettysburg, VICKSBURG, and Antietam and Bull Run. And as you can see, most of those nasty battles tend to be around Virginia. And so the area between the two capital cities of Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, that's where most of the fighting occurs. There are some western battles as far all the way over in Arizona, but mostly we're just going to talk about the big ones that really had an impact. Starting with Bull Run. This is the first major bloodshed of the war, occurring at Bull Run, and so it's just outside of Washington, D.C. in the summer of '61. They figured this would be a pretty fast war because the North had so many clear advantages that this would just be a fast 90-day war. But after the North loses this battle, things change. This makes Confederate General Stonewall Thomas Jackson famous, in that he is able to take the hits. His lines stand like a stone wall despite being hit many times by the North. He's able to stand, inspire his men, so that the South destroys the North, because he's able to stand like a stone wall. And so he inspires the Confederates to hold firm until reinforcements arrive, and they end up winning the day. And so the South starts off on a winning streak. It's a Confederate victory that really boosts Southern morale. After that, we get Tardy George McClellan. Tardy George as in he's always late, and he's not willing to fight. And so Lincoln's not too happy with him because he's not willing to get in and fight. The soldiers love him because he's not willing to take those risks. So McClellan is the first person to get command of the Army of the Potomac for the North. And in the Peninsula campaign, McClellan's army launches a waterborne attack. So they invade the South, trying to capture Yorktown, and very quickly the goal is take out their capital at Richmond. And so he's within sight of taking the capital at Richmond, but then the South hits back hard. Robert E. Lee meets him, and for what is known are the 7 days battles, which are 7 days. And he very quickly drives the North back into the ocean, and they are driven to the sea, they're picked up by the Navy, and they go back into the North to fight another day. So this was their big shot to just very quickly take out the Confederate capital, but Lee is just a much better general. The war at sea. So the major idea as far as the Anaconda Plan is to blockade all major ports. So no cotton can be sold in or out, no food can come in or out of the South. They're surrounded so they can't make money to buy the tools of war. And so they park their navies at all the major cities, the major ports, where most of the shipping would go through. Ships were developed by the South to get past this Navy. So the Navy was more powerful, so the South simply comes up with ships that are fast enough to get past the more powerful Navy. So they wouldn't have heavy cannons or anything to slow them down. Their goal is to run past the guns so they can sell cotton to other countries. Their goal is to very quickly get out of the South, go to the Caribbean, at neutral places like Havana, Nassau, to sell cotton to England and other countries there. And these ships are able to break the blockades up until the later parts, when eventually the blockades are strengthened and they figure out to put enough ships to stop these blockade runners. Other new technologies as far as naval warfare, ironclad ships. So we figure out the physics to have a completely iron ship in the water. And so we're no longer depending on wooden ships. And so these completely iron ships are going to have cannons on board, and they can splinter and ram into a wooden ship and sink it until the other side comes up with their own. And so this is the Battle of Hampton Roads, the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Monitor being the Union ship, and it's kind of like a tank. It has a rotating turret. And then the Merrimack, or the CSS Virginia, is a southern version where it has more cannons, but it doesn't have the maneuverability. It can't move as fast. And so in the end, they just kind of fight each other to a standstill, and so they're evenly matched. But it does change the way we fight naval warfare, and then we start to build our ships out of metal instead of wood. Another major new thing we come up with is the first true submarine in warfare. The South comes up with it. It's called the CSS Hunley. It is successful somewhat. It's just a big metal tube. The way it moves is you have about 9 guys inside the metal tube sitting on this bench, and they turn the crank just like this in order to move it. And so here I am sitting in a little reproduction. They would sneak up to a wooden ship, spear it with this harpoon, back away so that it blows up with all the dynamite inside the harpoon. It is successful in its single mission, but problem is we don't know what happens next, but it does sink to the bottom. There are many different scenarios, many different theories as to why this submarine sank. It did beat that ship, but in the end, it sank to the bottom of the harbor that it was fighting. And you can see this ship in Charleston today. But in the end, we don't know why it sank. One of the scenarios is that the shockwave from the explosion hit the submarine and it sank to the bottom. We were able to dig it up in the late 80s, early 90s, and so we can look at it today. Other new fun weapons. The rifles are more accurate. It's faster to load the rifles as compared to the Revolutionary War, and you can fire more rounds per musket. So now instead of 40 seconds, it can take your reload time down to 20 seconds or 30 seconds. We have new types of bullets, the mini ball, named after French bullet maker. It's much more destructive, it's faster, it's heavier than normal regular round balls. We also start to create landmines, and so all sorts of new ways to die. We also get trench warfare, we get siege tactics, and so a lot of new ways to fight and kill. And towards the end, we even start to get very early versions of machine guns with the Gatling gun. Another big battle, Antietam. Union General McClellan confronts Lee again in Antietam, Maryland. This is the bloodiest day in American history. September 17, 1862. 26,000 dead in one single day. And the problem was, well, Lee had plans. He gave his plans out to his generals. One of his generals wrapped those plans around in some cigars and then left off for the battle. Problem is he dropped the battle plans, that general. And so the North sent forward a scout to kind of pick around to see if they left anything behind. The scout picked up these cigars wrapped in paper and then opened up the paper and realized, oh, these are the battle plans. This is where Lee's going to go. So now the North knows exactly where Lee's going to go. And so they very quickly follow him, hit him hard at Antietam, and he goes all the way up to the water, all the way up to the river, and then McClellan stops. This was his chance. He knew about how many men, and he knew where he was going. This was his chance to take out Lee, but he stops short because he figured enough people have already died today. I don't want to push my luck, so he backs off. Lincoln fires him for that because he figures this was his shot to take out Lee. He lost it. It's not a victory on either side because the numbers are so high. So many die on both sides. But in the end, Lincoln was not happy. He saw this as the big chance. But it stops the Confederate march northward. So the Confederates kept getting closer and closer to D.C. This stops that. After a nice victory for that fall of 62, Lincoln decides we're going to make this about slavery now. Under the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves behind Confederate lines are now officially free. Although they're not going to run away because Lincoln says so, the slave masters aren't going to free them. But what this does allow is now the United States Army can actually go in and free slaves. So it gives direction to what the Army can do. And it's going to free slaves because slaves are considered property that are helping the Confederate effort in the war. And so while it doesn't actually free a single slave, it allows the war to change purpose. It changes how we fight. And so now this is about slavery. This is about something important, something real. And so it has a more high moral purpose for the Northerners. Plus it allows former slaves and free blacks in the North to fight in the Union Army. So this allows the Union Army to get bigger. And now the Confederates are going to have to double down because now this is officially about slavery. And so the South is going to have to fight harder now. And they even accused Lincoln of trying to start slave rebellions because, well, he kind of was. This also means we can't make any more deals. Compromise is no longer possible. It's going to be slavery or not. So African Americans join the Army in huge numbers because this is their fight. They were only 1% of the northern population. Free blacks were only 1% of the northern population. By the end of the war, 180,000 black men were fighting for the Union, and that's 10% of the army. So they are 1% of the population, but 10% of the army. So they are fighting disproportionately. They were discriminated against when they were in the army. They were given into segregated units, so all black units, and they were paid less as well. Plus, the South was really not happy to see black troops, so they threatened that if they caught any of these black soldiers, any prisoners of war, they would either be executed on the spot or they'd be sold back into slavery. As a result, these black men are going to have to fight really hard, and they really do fight harder, because if they get captured, they go back to slavery or they die. Alright, let's go through some general. Let's go through these major generals here. So after Antietam, Lincoln goes through a series of weak generals who are losing major battles in 1862-63. So first we have General Burnside, known for his sideburns. Yes, that's where that comes from. And so Burnside was fired after a massive defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia in 62. Then we have General Joseph Hooker, who replaced him, but he was fired after a massive defeat at Chancellorsville, a battle that he should have won. That's not where we get the phrase Hooker. That was an earlier phrase. I know you were thinking that. And so after these two losers, Lincoln decides, all right, let's go with somebody else. And he goes with General George Meade. And so the South defeated the North at Chancellorsville, as I just mentioned. And they also lose one of their best generals. Stonewall Jackson was out scouting to see where the North was. And then as the sun was setting, he comes back to his own lines. But because the sun was setting and the scouts weren't sure who was marching at them, they shot. And so he was shot by his own men because they didn't know who was coming at them on horseback. And so he got his arm cut off, and he does have a separate grave. It's on a farm. It's still out in the middle of nowhere. And so they cut the arm off, and then the army had to keep moving. And so the arm was buried. The army kept moving, but he does get sick and die of pneumonia. So he gets an infection from the wound when they cut off the arm, and he dies 8 days later of pneumonia. And so at this point, they lost their second best general after Lee. So it's a major hit on the edge of Gettysburg. Lee decides to invade the North to get supplies and perhaps get the support of Northern Democrats that hate Lincoln, too. It's a 3-day battle. It cripples the South. After this, they're going to go on a losing streak. That's the turning point of the war. The Confederates were looking for supplies. Some of them were going off to find things like shoes, which Gettysburg did have a factory of. And they meet the Union cavalry, so both sides realize, hey, they're here. They set up their lines. Union troops had about 90,000. Southern troops had about 75,000. Massive losses. 23,000 Union soldiers are lost. 28,000 Confederate soldiers are lost. So it's the biggest battle in all of American history. There's more people that die in this battle than in entire wars that we fought. After this, the Confederate retreats. Lee gives up any hope of invading the North, and he really loses his spirit. He starts to think that he's going to lose this thing. And so here they are getting ready. They're on July 1st, they run up to the top of the hills. The South tries to get around and flank them at Little Round Top. And then they try their last charge here with Pickett's charge, but it fails, and they head back down south to start a losing streak. And so the failure of Pickett's charge, as they run directly into cannons they didn't realize were there, enables the Union to win the battle. So this is their major loss. If they had won Gettysburg, they had a clear shot straight to Washington, D.C. The President of the South, Jeff Davis, was planning to deliver negotiators to D.C. if the South had won. But because they lost, they go back home, and Lincoln is not willing to negotiate. He doesn't let them come talk. So with about 40 to 50,000 dead bodies, they spend most of the summer designing a cemetery and burying those bodies. In November, they hold a ceremony to dedicate this new cemetery, and Lincoln gives a very short speech where he puts it all in perspective. He honors the dead soldiers, and he basically says it's time to double down. Now we have to actually fight to honor the people that died here. And so we need to dedicate ourselves to keep on fighting and win this thing. And so it's a very good rallying cry. People really respond to it. The same time as Gettysburg, Grant is winning at VICKSBURG. VICKSBURG was the last city to really control the Mississippi River. If they take this city, and this city is right along the river, And so no ships can get past it because anytime somebody gets close to this, any boat that goes past Vicksburg gets shot at. So if they can take Vicksburg, they have complete control of the Mississippi River. So in the spring, Ulysses S. Grant surrounds the city, destroys all the railroads, and for 40 days, they are just starving them out. And eventually, they do starve. People start to eat all their food, then they eat the horses, then they eat the mules, then they eat the cats and the dogs, and eventually people are starting to eat rats and whatever else they can find in the city. And at the same time as they're surrounded, Grant starts to bomb the city. So eventually a lot of the houses are bombed out, and people start to dig their own little caves inside the hills of the city. And so here's the city of Vicksburg living in caves and eating rats. And so eventually they realize, we have to give up. This is way too bad. But it's the same day that they lose at Gettysburg. So Gettysburg, Vicksburg, same day. This is the turning point for the war, where the South starts their losing streak. At this point, Lincoln decides to put 2 new guys in charge of the army. And so after defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederate morale is pretty much destroyed. They are hit hard. It's a sad 4th of July. A lot of them start to run away and become deserters, go home. Ulysses S. Grant, the winner of Vicksburg, and William Sherman are now in charge of the army. And if you can't tell from their faces, they're pretty angry guys, and they are going for total war. And you can see that in Sherman's eyes. He is known for the quote, "War is hell," and he really brings hell to the people of the South. His strategy is the march to the sea, so he's going to go from the west and march directly to the ocean, burning a path through every city in his way. So he's just going to destroy their morale. And so they destroy homes, they kill all the cows, they tear up the railroads. So all the supplies are dead. They're also capturing forts, capturing towns, stealing whatever they can. And it's psychological warfare. It weakens the morale of the men fighting in the front by destroying their homes, because the men of the South aren't going to be willing to keep on fighting if they have to worry about their family. After reaching the sea, his troops turn north, and following them are 25,000 former slaves. And so they're freeing slaves along the way, burning a path through the South. Meanwhile, we still have to have elections, we still have democracy. And so the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of War, formed in late 61, was dominated by just Republicans. It was all Republicans in the North, with a few Democrats here and there. And they weren't fans of Lincoln, so some people did run against Lincoln in this election. The Northern Democrats, however, were split on what to do about the war. And so the Democratic Party splits again in the North. There were the War Democrats who support Lincoln, and then there were Peace Democrats who just said, let's give up the South, we don't need them. And then there were extreme Democrats in the North who go so far as saying, we need to kill Lincoln, we need to declare war on him and join the South. And that's who Robert E. Lee was going after when he was going for Gettysburg, was trying to get these copperheads. Copperhead's a type of snake. And so these are the radical Peace Democrats that might even think about declaring war on Lincoln from the North. Clement Dean Vallandigham is one example, and he starts to come up with these conspiracy theories that Lincoln was black. And here he is, making him into a black dictator, basically. The main candidate, however, for the Democrats was the general that Lincoln just fired. George McClellan was just ready to surrender, saying, hey, we can't beat him, let's just surrender. And that's his platform. So the Republicans were a little worried, so they unite with the War Democrats to form a new party, the Union Party. And so he takes one War Democrat, Andrew Johnson, as his vice president, and they create the Union Party. Democrats, including the Copperheads, go for McClellan. Democrats lose the election horribly, and this was their last shot this was the Southern last shot to really win. After this, they're going to lose because Lincoln's just going to keep fighting. And so here's Lincoln and McClellan just as he's about to be fired. So it's a clear win for Lincoln. The South doesn't vote, so they don't get to be part of this election. McClellan gets a couple states, a couple border states mostly, but for the large part, people want to win this war. And so Lincoln gives his second inaugural address where he talks about forgiveness and just saying, hey, let's let the South alone. It's time to bind up the nation's wounds and take care of each other. So he's very forgiving in this speech as he's becoming president for his second term. And so here's a picture of him giving the speech, but as he's giving that speech, 3 assassins are waiting in the crowd. And so we've got John Wilkes Booth, who later will kill Lincoln. But there's 2 other assassins, and I'll talk about that class a little bit later. So his days are numbered, and he won't last much longer. Okay. In the end, Grant outlasts Lee. He's got a better strategy, and he's more willing to let his men die. And so Lincoln chooses Grant to lead the final assault to take out the capital at Richmond. Grant at this point has 100,000 men, boosted by black troops, and he engages Lee in a series of battles in the wilderness of Virginia, so all the forests around the capital. So this is known as the Wilderness Campaign, and some of the nastiest battles, because in the middle of these battles we often get forest fires, where the wounded are swallowed up by these forest fires, and if you go to these forests, in some cases you can still see bullets and cannonballs still in the forest. June 3rd, Grant orders the frontal assault on Cold Harbor, and Grant's troops hate him because he is willing to take risks, and thousands of Northern soldiers are killed within a matter of minutes in these battles. Grant's strategy is lose 2 of his men for every 1 of the Southern men, and it works. So he's known as Grant the Butcher because he's willing to take the risks of killing his own men to win this war. Finally, Lee is cornered, and the Union troops take the capital. It's all over. And so Lee surrenders at a little town called Appomattox. Lee and Grant meet to arrange an official surrender. Here's a little painting of them officially surrendering. It's over. At Lincoln's request, Lincoln is very nice. The South is welcomed back. They are not going to be punished for seceding. Everything is back to normal. Some of the nastiness as far as what we discover as we invade the South is the prisoner of war camps are pretty bad in the South. Andersonville is the worst case, as some Northern prisoners went to Andersonville, Georgia. It's a prison designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, but by the war's end, it's holding 3.5 times that. And so eventually it just becomes this large field where troops are just stuck out in the middle of nowhere, whether it's cold or hot. 1/3 of the troops in there die from starvation or exposure. 100 men are dying a day. And the commander of the prison had a choice: feed his own troops or feed these prisoners. At the end of the war, he is tried for war crimes, and the commander of the prison is tried and executed. And so here's one of the prisoners, and you can see the starvation, that they were just really not treating their prisoners according to the rules of war. Lincoln's assassinated, so the war is over, and he just has a few days to celebrate. He goes out to see a play, and a local actor is able to easily get inside that play and shoot him in the back of the head at Ford's Theater. This is the first president that is officially assassinated. His killer is escaped for 13 days, but eventually is shot and killed before we're able to put John Wilkes Booth on trial. Lincoln's body is put on a train, and so he makes this little tour back to his hometown, back to Springfield, Illinois, where the train stops in certain cities so everybody can pay their respects to the funeral train. And so 7 million Americans pay respects to the funeral train. 1/3 of all Americans are able to see the train as it passes back to Springfield, Illinois. So it's the biggest funeral that I know of in the world history. Big changes: 620,000 dead. If you combine nearly all the other wars we've ever fought, the Civil War is still deadlier. The role of the federal government has increased. The president becomes much more powerful. In every presidency, they get a little bit more powerful. And there's a larger economic gap between North and South, because with all the slaves gone, all the money of the South was tied up in slavery, and that's gone. So we start a nasty pattern where the North has money and the South doesn't. And in many ways, we're still recovering, in that there's still a lot of poverty in the South. There's still a lot of poor people in the South. 150 years later, we're still trying to catch up. As far as total deaths, battle deaths, 110,000, but mostly it's disease that's killing. And so 620,000 total deaths. But there are more deaths for the North because Grant is willing to take those sacrifices. Looking at this big picture, looking at the raw data, you can see total deaths for the Revolutionary War, 4,000. War of 1812, 2,000. Mexican War, 13,000. Civil War, 624,000. Spanish War, 2,000. World War I, 116. World War II is number 2 at 400,000. Korean War, 36. Vietnam, 58. So it's pretty clear, 49% of all deaths in American war have been from just this Civil War. Even looking at just the American deaths as percentage of the population, it's larger as a percentage of the population. About 1.75% of Americans died in this war. And if you just look at the battles, here's the Battle of Gettysburg versus Pearl Harbor, or even D-Day. And so it's clear this is a pretty nasty little war. We'll stop there.